I spent 41 years as a civil engineer. I designed drainage systems, oversaw road projects, reviewed blueprints at 6 in the morning before anyone else arrived at the office. I didn't take a real vacation until I was 53, and even then, I spent 2 days of it on the phone with a project manager in Knoxville. When I finally retired at 65, I had one plan, and one plan only. A piece of land I'd been watching for 11 years in the foothills of East Tennessee, 22 acres with a 1940s farmhouse that hadn't been touched since the previous owner died. I bought it for $187,000. Every dollar earned the way I earned everything, slowly, carefully, without shortcuts. Then my daughter-in-law called and told me her brother and his wife would be moving in by the end of the month. She said my son had already agreed. She said if I didn't like it, I could always sell the farm and move into a retirement community where I belonged. I didn't argue with her. I didn't raise my voice, but I started making calls that same evening, and by the time her brother's truck pulled into my driveway 6 weeks later, I was ready for all of them. The closing on the Harlan property took place on a Tuesday in October, the kind of morning where the fog sits low in the valley and the ridge turns gold above it. The attorney's office was in a converted Victorian in a small town called Calhoun, about 40 minutes from the land itself. I signed the papers with the same mechanical pencil I'd used for decades of engineering drawings. The notary stamped each page. The attorney, a quiet man named Gerald Poole who had handled property transfers in that county for 30 years, shook my hand and said the property had been waiting for someone who would take care of it. I drove out alone. The gravel road that led from the main highway wound through a quarter-mile of second-growth timber before opening onto the field. The farmhouse sat on a slight rise, white paint long faded to a chalky gray, the front porch sagging on the left side where a support post had given way. The barn behind it had lost half its roof. The fence lines were grown over with blackberry and sumac. A creek ran along the eastern edge of the property, cold and clear even in October, cutting through limestone shelves with a sound like someone shuffling cards. I stood in the field for a long time. I wasn't looking at what the property was. I was looking at what it was going to be. The first year was demolition and foundation work. I hired 2 local men to help brothers named Cody and Dale, who knew the difference between what could be saved and what couldn't. We tore out the rotted subfloor in the kitchen, replaced 3 compromised foundation piers, rebuilt the front porch from the framing up. I did everything I was licensed and capable of doing myself, which was most of it. I wired the outbuildings, plumbed the new bathroom addition, poured the footings for the covered back porch with my own hands. When my back gave me trouble, I worked slower. When it rained for 2 weeks straight in March, I waterproofed the basement and rewired the panel by flashlight when the power went out. My son Nathan drove down from Charlotte twice that first year. He helped me hang drywall in the main bedroom, and we spent an entire Saturday laying stone pavers around the garden beds his mother had sketched in a notebook before she passed. Nathan's mother, my wife Carol, had died 4 years before I bought the farm. She never saw it, but I had told her about it. Described the ridge, the creek, the way the light came through the kitchen window in the morning. She had said it sounded like the kind of place a person could finally rest. She was right about most things. By the time the farmhouse was finished, I had spent an additional $94,000 on materials and labor over 2 years. The original structure had been preserved where possible, the bones of it sound enough to justify the work. The result was something I was genuinely proud of, not a showpiece, but a proper home. Wide plank oak floors refinished to a warm amber, stone fireplace cleaned and repointed. The kitchen with soapstone counters and a 6-burner range I had waited my whole working life to cook on. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, the back porch looking out across the field to the ridge, where in the evenings the deer came out of the tree line one by one. I planted a kitchen garden. I kept 6 chickens. I learned to make bread, badly at first, and then acceptably. I read every book I'd told myself I would get to when I had time. In the evenings, I sat on the back porch with coffee and watched the sky change. No deadlines, no project specs, no one calling at 7:30 about a structural deviation that needed a decision before the concrete was poured. Just the field and the ridge and the creek sound and the particular silence of a place that is genuinely at peace. I had been living there 14 months when my daughter-in-law called. I knew her voice immediately, even before I checked the screen. She had a way of starting calls with my name, Walter, that managed to make 2 syllables sound like a mild accusation. We had always been polite to each other in the way that people are when they coexist in the same family without particularly choosing each other. She was efficient and organized, and entirely focused on whatever she had decided mattered, and what she had decided mattered was usually something that required other people to adjust their plans. "Walter," she said, "I need to talk to you about a situation." I was on the back porch. The sun was still an hour above the ridge. I set down my coffee. She told me that her brother Kevin and his wife Sherry had been going through a difficult stretch. Their rental in Greensboro had ended when the landlord sold the building. They'd had trouble finding another place in their price range and had been staying with her and Nathan for the past 6 weeks. The apartment, she explained, was too small for 4 adults, and Nathan's work schedule had made things tense. She'd been thinking about it, and the solution was obvious. I had 3 bedrooms and only used 1. Kevin and Sherry were good people who would take care of the property. It would be temporary, maybe 3 or 4 months, until they got back on their feet. I said, "I don't believe we've discussed this." She said, "I'm discussing it now." I asked her if Nathan knew about this plan. She said Nathan understood that family took care of each other. There it was. Not a yes. Not Nathan's actual voice agreeing to anything. Just the principle. I said, "Cassie, I spent 2 years and a significant amount of money restoring this property. It's my home. I'm not a hotel." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Kevin and Sherry are responsible adults. They're not going to damage anything. And honestly, Walter, you're 65 years old, living alone on 22 acres in the middle of nowhere. You should be grateful someone's willing to stay out there with you." I should be grateful. I turned that over carefully. She kept going. "My brother has had a hard year. His wife just lost her job. They need stability right now, and you have more than enough space to provide it. Nathan agrees this is the right thing to do. If you can't see that, then maybe this farm isn't the right situation for you anyway. There are very nice assisted living communities in that part of Tennessee. We've looked into a few of them." The call ended a few minutes later. I sat on the porch until the sun dropped behind the ridge and the field went from gold to gray. The deer came out as usual, 3 does, and a young buck, moving through the tall grass along the fence line. I watched them until they disappeared into the timber. Then I went inside and sat at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and a mechanical pencil and began to write down what I needed to do. The first call the next morning was to a property attorney in Calhoun. I'd already worked with Gerald Poole on the purchase, and he took my call before 9. I explained the situation without editorializing. My daughter-in-law had informed me that her brother and his wife would be moving into my home. I had not agreed. I wanted to understand my rights and my options. Gerald said what I already knew but wanted to hear stated formally. The property was mine, held in my name alone. No other person had any legal standing to invite occupants into it, including my son. If individuals arrived and refused to leave after I'd clearly told them to go, that was trespassing. He recommended that I document everything and, if necessary, provide written notice of no trespass before any confrontation occurred. I asked about the process if they came and refused to leave. He said we'd call the sheriff's department. McMinn County had clear procedures. It would not be complicated. I appreciated the simplicity of that. The second call was to my insurance agent. I had a homeowner's policy with a rider for the outbuildings. My agent confirmed that unauthorized long-term occupants could create significant liability exposure and potentially complicate any future claims. He recommended I notify him formally if any occupancy situation changed. I told him I did not intend for it to change and was calling to ensure I understood my coverage in case someone arrived without my permission. He said, "Walter, you've had the same policy for 20 years and never filed a claim. You're the most careful client I have." I said I was just being thorough. That same afternoon, I drove to the hardware store in Athens and bought 2 trail cameras, the kind with cellular capability that sent photos directly to my phone. I had used similar equipment at a construction site years ago to monitor material deliveries. I knew how to position them. I installed one at the entrance to the gravel drive, hidden in the fork of a cedar tree, and one under the eave of the barn, covering the approach to the house. Both were motion-activated with night capability. I tested each one from my phone and adjusted the angles until the coverage was complete. On Thursday, I drove 40 minutes north to Cleveland and found an attorney whose practice focused on family and property law. Her name was Patricia Marsh, and she had the manner of someone who had heard every version of every family dispute and was surprised by none of them. I laid out the situation. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Do you have documentation of the conversation where your daughter-in-law made this demand?" I said I did not have a recording of the phone call, but I had saved several text messages in which she referenced the arrangement and mentioned a move-in date. Patricia nodded. "Save everything. Every text, every voicemail, every email. If they arrive and you ask them to leave and they refuse, you call me first and then you call the sheriff. Don't engage in an argument. State clearly that they are not welcome on your property and that you're asking them to leave. Say it once, calmly, and then document that you said it." I hired her on a $1,500 retainer. She shook my hand at the door and said, "For what it's worth, you have every right to do exactly what you're doing." I said I knew that. I just wanted to make sure I did it correctly. That weekend, Nathan called. His voice had the careful quality of someone reading from a mental script. "Dad, I've been thinking about the situation with Kevin and Sherry." I said, "Have you?" He said, "Cassie's pretty stressed about it. They've really been struggling, and I know the farm has the space. I was thinking maybe we could just try it for a couple of months and see how it goes." I said, "Nathan, did you agree to this before Cassie called me?" A pause. She mentioned it to me. I said I'd think about it. "So you didn't agree?" He was quiet for a moment. "Dad, she's been carrying a lot. Her family is her responsibility, and she takes that seriously. I just think if we could help them out, it would go a long way toward—" I said, "Son, this is my home. I built it. I paid for it. No one gets to move someone into it without asking me. And asking means waiting for an answer. Your wife didn't ask. She informed me." He sighed. I know that. I said, "Come down this weekend. Just you. I'd like to talk to you in person." He came on a Saturday. When he got out of the car, I could see the tension in his shoulders before he even turned around the set of a man who was being pulled in two directions and had been for some time. We walked the property. I showed him the garden, the repairs I'd made to the barn roof over the summer, the section of fence line along the creek I'd rebuilt. He helped me split firewood for 2 hours, and after that we sat on the back porch with iced tea. He asked me why I was being so firm about this. I said, "Because the pattern concerns me more than the immediate request." He asked what I meant. I said, 6 weeks ago, Kevin and Sherry moved into your apartment without being invited to stay more than a night or two. Is that right?" He looked at the field. "More or less." I said, "And now they're being relocated to my property because the arrangement stopped being convenient. Nathan, I'm not a backup plan. And you need to ask yourself what happens when 3 or 4 months becomes 6, and 6 becomes permanent, and Kevin and Sherry are still here, when I need to have a conversation with you that I'm not sure you're ready to have." He asked what conversation. I told him I wasn't ready either. Not yet. But I was going to find some things out first. I said that whatever I found, I'd tell him the truth. That was the only promise I was making. He drove home Sunday afternoon. I watched his car go down the gravel drive and turn onto the highway. Then I went inside and called a private investigator in Chattanooga whose name Patricia had given me. His name was Dennis Whitfield. He had 20 years of experience and a flat, professional manner. I gave him the names and asked for a background report on Kevin and Sherry, financial and general. The cost was $450. He said he'd have something for me within the week. The report arrived by email on a Friday evening. I poured a glass of bourbon and read it at the kitchen table. Kevin had a judgment against him from 2021, $23,000. A contractor dispute from a renovation business he'd operated for 3 years before it failed. He had 2 vehicles with outstanding loan balances. His credit score was in the low 500s. Sherry had filed for a Chapter 13 bankruptcy in 2020, which was still on her record. The job Cassie had told me Sherry recently lost had in fact ended 14 months ago, not recently. They had not had stable housing since their lease ended in Greensboro. Before that, according to the report, they had lived with Sherry's mother for 8 months. There was more. Dennis had flagged several financial transactions that appeared in records he was able to access through public filings. Over the past 10 months, transfers totaling approximately $38,000 had moved from accounts associated with Nathan and Cassie's household to accounts in Kevin's name. The transfers were described in memo lines as loans, $38,000. I sat with that number for a long time. I thought about Nathan's apartment in Charlotte, which I knew he was renting because he and Cassie had been saving for a house. They had talked about it at Christmas. Cassie had shown me a neighborhood she liked, walking distance to a good school district, thinking ahead. Nathan had said they were about a year out from having the down payment. That conversation was 18 months ago. I thought about Nathan's face when he got out of the car last weekend, the tiredness in it. I called Dennis back and asked if there was anything else he could find about the current financial picture. He said he could do a deeper pull for another $300. I said do it. The second report came 3 days later. Cassie had left her marketing job 9 months ago. She had not told Nathan. She had been drawing from their shared savings account at a rate that, according to Dennis's calculations, would drain it completely within 4 months. She had also applied for a home equity line of credit on the Charlotte apartment, the apartment they were renting. She had used Nathan's income information in the application without his knowledge. The application had been denied, but the inquiry was on record. She had also contacted a property attorney in Nashville, not local to their area, for a consultation. The subject of the consultation, according to a billing record Dennis found, was the mechanism by which a family member might establish a partial ownership claim to real property through financial contribution. I had to read that last part twice. She was planning to claim that the money transferred to Kevin constituted a loan from me, or some contribution to the farm's maintenance, and use that as a basis to assert a partial interest in my property. It was a reach, legally. Patricia would later tell me it was unlikely to succeed in Tennessee court, given the clear title in my name and the absence of any documented agreement. But it wouldn't have to succeed to cost me time, money, and a great deal of stress. And someone had been willing to at least discuss the theory with her. I closed the laptop and looked out the kitchen window at the field. The sun was going down. The ridge was outlined in orange. I wasn't angry in the way I'd expected to be. I was something quieter than that. Resolved, maybe. The way I felt at the start of a complicated project when I'd finished the assessment and knew exactly what needed to happen. I called Patricia. She listened to the summary of both reports. When I finished, she said, "You did the right thing getting this documented now. Here's what I want you to do." She walked me through a letter she wanted me to send to Cassie directly, via certified mail, formally notifying her that no person had permission to occupy the property without my written consent, and that any attempt to assert a property interest would be contested. She also recommended I send a copy to her attorney of record, whoever that Nashville lawyer was. I said, "My son doesn't know any of this yet." She said, "I understand that's complicated, but Nathan needs to know at some point, and it's better he hears it from you than discovers it another way." "I know," I said. The certified letters went out the following Monday. On Wednesday afternoon, the motion sensor at the driveway entrance sent an alert to my phone. I looked at the feed and saw a dark blue pickup truck with North Carolina plates coming slowly up the gravel road. I already had my coffee. I set it down, walked to the front door, and stepped out onto the porch. The truck pulled up and parked beside the garden. A man got out from the driver's side, heavyset, wearing a Braves cap, looking around at the property with the same expression I had seen before on people who were calculating what something was worth. A woman got out from the passenger side, thin, with a manner that suggested she found most things either disappointing or beneath her. She looked at the house, looked at the barn, looked at the chicken yard, and pressed her lips together. I stepped off the porch. I said, "Kevin, Sherry, I wasn't expecting you." Kevin spread his hands in a gesture meant to indicate reasonableness. He said Cassie had told them the arrangement was settled. He said they'd driven 4 hours and were tired. He said the place looked like it needed some work around the barn. I said the barn was fine. He said, "Look, Walter, we know this is your place. We're not trying to step on your toes. We just need somewhere to land for a few months while we figure out the next step," Cassie said. I said, "Cassie doesn't make decisions about my property. I do." Sherry crossed her arms. She said, "We're family." I said, "You're my daughter-in-law's family." "That's not the same thing. You and I have had dinner together 3 times in 5 years. I appreciate you making the drive, but I'm telling you clearly that I did not agree to this, and you are not staying here." Kevin's face changed. The reasonable expression dropped. He said, "You're going to turn family away because of some technical point about whose name is on the deed?" I said, "It's not a technical point. It's my home." He said, "Cassie told us you were difficult. I thought she was exaggerating." I said, "I'm going to ask you once, politely, to get back in your truck and find a hotel. There's a decent one in Athens, about 25 minutes from here. I'll even write down the number if you need it." Sherry said, "This is unbelievable." Kevin said, "We're not leaving. We drove 4 hours. We have a right to at least." I said, "You don't have a right to be on this property. I own it. You were not invited. If you'd like to continue this conversation, you can do it with my attorney. Her number is on the letter I sent to Cassie earlier this week." Something shifted when I said that. Kevin looked at Sherry. Sherry looked at Kevin. Kevin pulled out his phone and stepped away, and I could hear him calling Cassie, his voice low and then rising. I went back to the porch and waited. The call lasted about 8 minutes. When it was over, Kevin walked back to the truck and said something to Sherry. She grabbed her purse from the seat with the energy of someone making a point. They got in the truck. Kevin backed around the garden, stopped at the edge of the drive, and looked at me one more time through the windshield. I looked back. They left. I went inside, checked the camera footage, confirmed every moment was recorded, sent the clips to my own email with timestamps, and then called Patricia to let her know what had happened. She said I had handled it exactly right. That evening, Cassie called. I let it go to voicemail. The message was 7 minutes long and covered quite a bit of ground, including my character, my relationship with Nathan, my suitability as a father figure, and my probable loneliness in my old age. She said I would regret this. She said Nathan would hear about how I treated his family. She said she had documentation that I owed them money and that she intended to act on it. I saved the voicemail. I transcribed it and added the transcription to the folder I was building, along with the camera footage, the certified mail receipts, the PI reports, and the text messages. 3 weeks passed. They were quiet weeks on the farm, in the way a river is quiet before it narrows. I spent them doing what I always did, tending the garden, maintaining the property, reading in the evenings, watching the deer come out of the timber at dusk. I also spent time reviewing everything I had accumulated and thinking about Nathan. My son was 40 years old. He had a good job at an engineering consulting firm in Charlotte. He had married Cassie 7 years ago in a ceremony at the Botanical Garden, and I had danced with her at the reception and meant it genuinely when I said I was glad to have her in the family. The Nathan I had raised was honest and hard-working and had Carol's stubborn streak when he believed in something. The Nathan I was watching had become someone who said I'll think about it when he meant no and sent emails without reading them and looked, when he thought no one was looking, like a man who had forgotten what solid ground felt like. I did not blame him. I had seen this before. Not in families I knew personally, but in project teams, in organizations, the slow erosion that happens when a capable person is consistently told that their instincts are wrong, their concerns are overblown, and that the right thing to do is whatever keeps the peace. I called him on a Sunday morning. He picked up on the second ring. I asked how he was doing. He said fine, in the way that meant not fine. I asked if Cassie was home. He said she was at the grocery store. I said, Nathan, I need you to come down here. This week, if you can. Something important. He asked if it was about Kevin and Sherry. I said it was about more than that. He arrived Wednesday evening, later than he'd planned because there had been traffic outside Chattanooga. He looked worse than the last visit, thinner in the face. The tiredness settled deeper. I made coffee and put together a plate of food from the refrigerator, and we sat at the kitchen table. He said, Cassie's furious about the letter from your attorney. I said I imagined she was. He said, Dad, she says you're trying to start a legal fight with her family. She says you've been... I said, Nathan, before you tell me what Cassie says, I need to show you something. And I need you to look at it without her voice in your head. Just for a few minutes. Can you do that? He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said yes. I put the folder on the table and walked him through it. I did it the way I would have presented findings to a client methodically, without drama, letting the documents speak for themselves. The PI report on Kevin and Sherry. The financial history. The $38,000 in transfers from their household accounts. The timeline of Cassie's employment. The application for the home equity line of credit using his income information without his knowledge. The attorney consultation in Nashville. The nature of that consultation. I watched his face as he read. I watched him stop at the $38,000 figure and go still. I watched him go back and read it again. I watched him turn to the page about the Nashville attorney and read it twice, slowly. He set the papers down and looked out the window at the field, where it was too dark now to see anything, just the reflection of the kitchen light in the glass. He said, She told me those transfers were for her brother's business, a startup, an investment. I said, I know. He said, She said it might be 2 years before we see any return on it, but that Kevin was building something real. I said, Kevin has had 3 business ventures in the past 8 years. None of them have succeeded. He currently has a $23,000 judgment against him and cannot qualify for a rental agreement. That's in the report. Nathan put his hand over his mouth. He sat like that for a while. Outside, the creek made its sound in the dark. He said, She's been lying to me. About the money. About her job. I said, Yes. He said, For how long? I said, At least 9 months, that can be documented. Possibly longer. He said, Dad, that was our down payment. We've been talking about a house for 2 years. I have been. I've been working doubles, picking up consulting projects on weekends. I thought we were close. I thought we were almost there. I said, I know, son. He stood up and walked to the back door and opened it and stood there looking out at the dark field for a long time. I let him. I got up and made more coffee and put it on the table. Eventually, he came back and sat down. He said, Why would she do this? I said, I don't know the full answer to that. But I think Kevin and Sherry have been in trouble for a long time, and Cassie feels responsible for them in a way that overrides other commitments. That's not an excuse. It's just what I think is happening. He said, She was going to try to put a claim on your property. I said, She consulted someone about it. Whether she would have followed through, I can't say, but it's in the record. He put his hands flat on the table. He said, If you hadn't stood your ground about Kevin and Sherry coming here, if you'd just let them move in, I said, I would never have found this out, and neither would you. He stayed 3 days. We didn't spend them talking about Cassie or Kevin or attorneys or down payments. We rebuilt the south section of the fence line along the creek, worked that needed doing anyway. We cooked on the 6-burner range, elaborate things I'd been learning to make a proper pot roast, cornbread from scratch, a peach cobbler that didn't turn out as planned but tasted fine anyway. On his last evening, we sat on the back porch and watched the deer come out of the timber, and neither of us said anything for a long time. When he finally spoke, he said, I've been afraid to see it clearly because seeing it meant having to do something about it. I said, I know. That's what she was counting on. He said, What do I do, Dad? I said, That's not something I can answer for you. But I can tell you that whatever you decide, I'm here. That doesn't change. He drove back to Charlotte on a Thursday morning. I watched the truck go down the gravel road and disappear into the timber. The fog was still in the valley. A red-tailed hawk was sitting on the fence post at the edge of the field, completely still, watching something in the grass. The weeks that followed were hard, in ways I couldn't protect him from. Nathan confronted Cassie. She admitted the job. She did not fully admit the extent of the financial transfers, claiming some of the amounts were mistaken in the report, but the documentation was clear enough that her position was difficult to maintain. She told him the Nashville attorney consultation had been a misunderstanding. She told him he was overreacting. She told him that his father was manipulative and had always tried to come between them. She told him a great deal of things, and Nathan listened to all of them, and then called me afterward, and we talked through what was real and what wasn't, carefully, the way I had taught him to read a blueprint, looking for what was actually on the page, rather than what someone claimed was there. The marriage counselor they saw for 6 weeks told Nathan privately that the pattern he was describing had a name and that it was not his fault. He told me that later, quietly, and I could hear in his voice that hearing it from someone outside the family had meant something. Cassie filed for divorce in February. She retained an aggressive attorney who sent a letter to Patricia outlining a potential claim against my property based on alleged financial contributions. Patricia sent back a document package that included the certified mail records, the attorney consultation record with its dates, and a polite but thorough explanation of why the claim had no legal foundation under Tennessee property law. The attorney representing Cassie did not respond to that letter. 2 weeks later, he withdrew from the case. Cassie moved out of the Charlotte apartment in March. Kevin and Sherry moved up from wherever they'd been staying and helped her, and the 3 of them rented a 2-bedroom in a suburb south of Charlotte. I heard this from Nathan, not with satisfaction, just as information. What I noticed in Nathan over those months was less dramatic than what I'd expected. No sudden lightness, no visible unburdening. It was quieter than that. The careful quality in his voice slowly disappeared. The exhaustion lifted in stages, the way land dries out after a flood gradually, unevenly, but in one direction. He started calling me twice a week instead of once. He started talking about work again with the energy he'd had years ago, before all of it. He drove down in April for a long weekend. We planted the kitchen garden together, tomatoes, beans, a row of basil along the southern edge. We took the canoe out on the section of the creek that widened into a slow pool below the lower field, drifting through the late afternoon shade while the redbud trees bloomed on the bank. He said, "I've been looking at places to live. Different places, not Charlotte." I asked where he'd been looking. He said East Tennessee was on the list. He had some contacts at an engineering firm in Knoxville. He'd had a preliminary conversation. I didn't say anything for a moment. I watched the current move under the bow. I said, "You know, I'd be glad to have you nearby, but that's not a reason to make a decision." He said, "I know, but it's not a reason either." He laughed. I hadn't heard him laugh like that in a long time. Genuine, without anything held back. He took the job in Knoxville in June and found a place to rent on the north side of the city, 15 minutes from the highway that came down to the farm. He drove down most weekends, sometimes to help with a project, sometimes just to sit. We had dinner on the back porch on Friday nights, when the weather allowed. He brought good wine and I cooked, and we talked about things that had nothing to do with lawyers or divorce proceedings or people who wanted what they hadn't earned. He started seeing someone in the fall, a structural engineer from his firm named Dana, who had grown up on a farm herself in Western Virginia and had strong opinions about heirloom tomatoes and post-frame construction. The first time she came to the farm, she walked the perimeter of the property before she came inside, looking at the fence work and the barn reconstruction and the creek crossing I'd built from salvaged limestone. She said the footings on the back porch addition were well done for a self-taught job. I said I'd spent 41 years in civil engineering and wasn't entirely self-taught. She said it showed. I liked her immediately. Nathan watched the two of us talking and looked the way a person looks when they've been cold for a long time and finally step into warm air. The divorce finalized in November. Nathan called me from the parking lot of his attorney's office, and his voice was steady and clear in a way it hadn't been in over a year. He said, "It's done." I said, "How do you feel?" He said, "Relieved. Mostly just relieved, and a little angry at myself for how long it took me to see what was happening." I said, "Don't hold on to that part too long." He said, "I keep thinking about that first weekend I came down to the farm. You said you needed to find some things out before you were ready to talk to me. What were you finding out?" I said, "Whether what I suspected was true, and whether you were going to be okay once you knew it." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Were you worried I wouldn't be?" I said, "No, not seriously." He said, "Why not?" I said, Because your mother raised you, and I know what that's worth. He didn't say anything for a while. I could hear traffic in the background. He said, Dad, I'm sorry I let her put me in the middle. I'm sorry I let her use me against you. You were right about all of it, and I wasn't ready to hear it. I said, You trusted your wife. That's what you were supposed to do. The failure wasn't in trusting. It was in her. He said, I should have seen it sooner. I said, You saw it when you needed to, and you did what needed to be done. That's not nothing. The following spring, Nathan proposed to Dana on the back porch of the farmhouse. He told me afterward that he'd asked her there because it was the place where he'd started to understand what it meant to choose someone who was actually on your side. I didn't have a ready answer to that. I just told him I was glad for both of them. They were married in September in a simple ceremony at a vineyard in the Sequatchie Valley. 40 people, most of them Dana's family and friends from their firm. I gave a short toast that made people laugh and made Dana's mother cry. Nathan's hand on my shoulder when he came to thank me afterward felt like the weight of something real. I drove home that night through the river valley with the windows down, the air still warm at 10 o'clock, the stars thick above the ridge. I thought about what I had bought when I signed those papers in Gerald Poole's office 2 years before the property, yes, but also the particular fight that came with protecting it. The phone calls and attorneys and certified letters and the hard conversation at the kitchen table with my son. None of that was what I'd had in mind when I stood in the field that first morning and looked at the house on the rise. But you don't always get to choose what peace costs. Sometimes you just have to decide it's worth it. A year later, I was sitting on the back porch on a November morning with coffee and a book I wasn't reading, watching the frost come off the field as the sun climbed above the ridge. The chickens were making noise in their yard. The creek was high from 2 days of rain. I heard a car on the gravel and then 2 cars, and Nathan and Dana came around the corner of the house together, Dana holding something against her coat that I couldn't quite see. She was holding it carefully, the way you hold something fragile and new. They walked up the porch steps. Dana held out what she'd been carrying, a piece of paper with a sonogram image printed on it, grainy and uncertain, the way all beginnings look before they come into focus. Nathan said, We wanted you to be the first to know. I looked at the image for a long time. I thought about this land and the years it had taken to build something worth protecting, and the years it would take to teach someone small and new what it meant to love a particular patch of ground, a particular light on a particular ridge, the way the creek sounds in November when the rain has come through. I said, I'd like that very much. Dana sat down beside me, and Nathan leaned against the porch rail, and we stayed like that for a while, the 3 of us, watching the morning come into the valley. The deer were out along the fence line. A hawk was working the thermals above the upper field, circling slowly, waiting. I had bought this farm for solitude. What I had built instead was harder to name and worth considerably more. My son had clear eyes and a good woman beside him, and something growing between them. The people who had tried to take what I'd built were somewhere else now, still looking for what the next person might give them. And I was here, on this land, which was mine in every way a thing can be mine, not just by deed, but by the work of my hands and the years of my life, and the fight I had chosen to make when it was necessary. I picked up my coffee cup. The frost was almost gone now, the field opening up green and ordinary in the morning light. Sometimes, protecting what matters is the most important work you'll ever do, not because what you're protecting is the point, but because the people who come after you deserve to inherit something built with integrity. They deserve to know that it was worth defending, that you didn't let it go because it was easier than holding on. I had held on. Everything else had followed from that. I called Nathan's name, and when he looked over, I raised my cup. He smiled, the real one, the one I'd almost forgotten and found again. He raised his in return. Good enough. For the first time in longer than I could measure, everything was exactly what it was supposed to be.